On the right of me was the son of Rudolf Hess, Wolf Rudiger Hess, very nice man, who alas died 10 years ago. And on the other side of me was a dummy. It was a tailor's dummy wearing a uniform. Wearing the uniform of the German Air Force, lieutenant, which was the actual uniform that Rudolf Hess had worn when he made that flight. You may wonder how he came to survive, how that uniform came to survive, and because the British had given instructions that everything connected with Rudolf Hess was to be destroyed. So Rudolf Hess was dead by then. He had died 4 years earlier. But the uniform is there on that tailor's dummy next to me. Very well made, very well tailored, in fact, made by one of the finest tailors in Munich. German Air Force lieutenant's uniform, trousers, flying boots, leather helmet, Snoopy helmet, kind of like Snoopy wears sometimes. The reason it survived was because it had been hanging on a nail behind the door of Rudolf Hess's cell in Spandau prison when he died. And it was then stolen by 2 British soldiers from that nail and put on the equivalent of eBay in those days in some flea market in Berlin, where it was found by the police, and the 2 soldiers were identified and arrested, put on trial, and the uniform was the exhibit in the trial. The soldiers were duly convicted and sentence was passed on them. And the British government demanded the uniform should be turned over to them along with all Rudolf Hess's other property, so they could destroy it along with all the other things connected with Rudolf Hess and his imprisonment. But the German police refused to. They said, no, this belongs to the family, and they handed it over to the son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, which is why it survived. And it survives somewhere today, presumably, with Rudolf Hess's grandson. His son and the grandson were both charged by the German government with breaking some law, with having opinions that were not duly rubber-stamped and endorsed by the German government, and they expressed these opinions in public, and father and son were both arrested, but only the grandson of Rudolf Hess survived to go on trial, and he was fined in the way that people do get fined in Germany if they express their opinions. That uniform was significant in many ways. You'll find it plays a very important part in the story of Rudolf Hess right throughout his life. You wonder why, of course, why was he wearing a uniform of a German Air Force officer when he flew to Britain? What would he need to do that? He actually had this specially made for him a week or 2 before he made the flight. Why would he wear a uniform? If he flew into Britain in plain clothes, then he'd be arrested and hanged as a spy. That was the risk you take.
Wasn't he masquerading as Alfred Horn?
He was masquerading as Alfred Horn, Lieutenant Alfred Horn, thank you. But if Alfred Horn had flown into Britain wearing plain clothes and not wearing a military uniform, then he too could have been arrested and executed as a spy. And I guess Rudolf Hess decided he didn't want to run the risk of that. He had covered all his bases, and that was one base he covered too. So he went to a very fine tailor in Munich and had a very fine Air Force uniform made for him, which exists still to this day, thanks to the Berlin police and Wolf Rudiger Hess, the son, who was a good friend of mine. Wolf Rudiger Hess gave me a lot of assistance when I was writing my book. John Stuart Mill, the famous British essayist on liberty, he wrote another essay in which he said that the borderline between insanity and genius is very fine. And I think that was the case with Rudolf Hess, who was a man of extreme cleverness. When you hear about the preparations he made for his famous flight, you realize this is not a normal man at all. He's thinking far ahead. He's thinking leaps and bounds ahead of things that may go wrong, like getting the uniform made, for example. When you look in the films taken by Leni Riefenstahl, like a very famous, Leni Riefenstahl's very famous film of the 1934 party rally, Triumph of the World. You've probably seen bits of it on television. He's the keynote speaker, Rudolf Hess, and the camera closes in on him. You look at Rudolf Hess's face and you can see this fanatical gleam in his eye. By the time the film was made, of course, he was Deputy Führer. He had risen to the highest rank he could in the German Nazi Party. And it's worth saying that, in fact, he was born in the British Empire, so he had everything going for him. He was born in Egypt, in Alexandria, the city of Alexandria. He was born in Alexandria. His father was a businessman in Egypt. His mother lived in Egypt too, and they stayed there until the outbreak of the war, which is a good thing for us British, because we're not exactly gentlemen when it comes to reading people's mail and opening their letters. I mean, I know you Americans, you wouldn't dream of listening on people's conversations or driving past their front doors, taking photographs of their motor cars and all the kind of stuff that goes on in this country. But Rudolf Hess wrote regular letters to his parents in Egypt. He was rising up through the ranks. He had been with Hitler in the fortress of Landsberg as a penalty for the failed Hitler Putsch in Munich in 1923. He and Hitler and a dozen others have been sentenced to terms of imprisonment for high treason, which in Germany is an honorable offense. You get fined quite a lot for parking offenses or speeding offenses in Germany, but if you commit high treason, there's a slap on the wrist and a year and a half in the local fortress. Fortress imprisonment is something decent and honorable and chivalrous. Hitler was sent to the fortress of Landsberg, Rudolf Hess with him, and 3 or 4 of his their accomplices. And they all mucked in and helped Adolf when he began writing his book, Mein Kampf. Prison is a good place for writing books, I know. Thanks to the Canadian taxpayers and thanks to the Hungarian taxpayers and elsewhere, I've sampled prisons in most countries around the world now where I've been. If you can ask for solitary confinement, do so. It is infinitely better than being thrown in cells with people who are going to smoke and drink and complain the whole time about how rotten life has been to them and they didn't do it and they're really innocent. If you're in solitary confinement, you've got 6 foot of armor plate between you and the criminal world in the rest of the building and the even more criminal world outside the building. The only problem you have when you're in prison is getting ink, because ink in prison is considered to be contraband. It's worse than drugs. I mean, if you have ink, if you have a fountain pen that needs ink, and I write always with ink. I write all my books with ink. So when I was first in solitary confinement, I thought, well, what you've got is what you see, and I wrote increasingly short words so as not to use up my ink. I was working on my Heinrich Himmler biography. I'm still working on it, and on my autobiography, and on volume 3 of Churchill. And it went on like that in prison for a week or 2 because ink is contraband. They think if you have ink, you will set up a tattooing business in your cell. They're not thinking straight. If you're on solitary confinement and there's a door between you and your customers, your business is not going to be brisk. You're going to be in here and they're going to be out there, and there's this door between you. But eventually the pastor took pity on me and he bought me a box of cartridges. And then one of the prison officers bought me 16 boxes of cartridges because they wanted to see me carry on writing. The prison officers were all on my side, whereas the Austrian government wasn't on my side. The Ministry of Justice announced that they had discovered that 120 of my books, 120 books by Mr. Irving, are in the prison library system. And we have ensured that all these books are now withdrawn from the Austrian prison libraries, and we have destroyed all his books. They have been burnt. We don't want people saying that the Austrian government is in any way Nazi. Burning books and Nazis, there's a kind of association there between them. So, the prison officers were on my side. On Christmas Eve, my first Christmas Eve in prison, we don't have Thanksgiving in England, of course. Well, we do, but we celebrate Thanksgiving on July the 4th. We got rid of the Americans. My first Christmas Eve, in prison in Austria, there was a tap on my door. About 11 o'clock at night. And there was a tap on my door, and I think, who's this idiot knocking on my... Does he think I have a secret key I can let him in? But no, it was the block lighter, the block chief. And he opened the door very, very softly, and he beckoned me out. And I tiptoed down the corridor outside with him, past all the other cells. And he opened his office door and closed the office door behind us, and then he opened his file cabinet, took out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, and he said, Mr. Irving, this remains strictly between the 2 of us. The officers were all on my side. Prison. I wrote my Himmler book. Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. Well, he didn't, of course. It was a kind of cooperative enterprise between Adolf Hitler and Hans Frank and Rudolf Hess. So Mein Kampf isn't really Adolf Hitler. If you want to find Adolf Hitler's real views, you're going to have to go to a couple of other books. For example, the wartime views of Adolf Hitler. Where would you find that? Hitler's Table Talk. Years later, I was down in Spain with that book, and I had Elke Fröhlich with me, who is a German famous historian, and she's reading the book, and she says, it's extraordinary, Hitler. I never realized this, but his insight into the mentality of women, for example, he knew, and at this point I had to gasp. I mean, insight into the mentality of women. That's something that we gentlemen can't really boast of. Hitler understood the female mentality, which explains why eventually in 1938, he got 48 million votes when he went to the polls about the last time. He got 48 million people voting yes for Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, and about 100,000 disgruntled dunderheads who voted no. And I'm going to shock you by saying that National Socialism wasn't a very bad idea. It's a very good idea. The American ambassador, in fact, I think his name was Wilson, Harold Wilson, something like that. No, Henry Wilson. American ambassador in 1938, before he was recalled. He wrote a letter to Roosevelt saying that this German Labour Front of Robert Hitler has an extraordinarily good organization, and we can learn a thing or two from that. And he wrote a 20-page letter setting out all the good things about National Socialism. Somebody rightly said the trouble with most isms is the ists, and there were quite a lot of corrupt National Socialists. And it's going to shock you when I tell you that politicians can be corrupt and they can be more interested in power and vested interest. And that's, if only they could take money out of the political equation in Washington, this would be a much happier country, I think. But it can't be. It seems to be hardwired into this country's economy as well. What we call corruption is in Washington apparently the normal procedure of the day. National Socialism is a great thing. One of Hitler's adjutants, Alvin Broder Albrecht, he wrote a last letter to his wife on May the 1st, 1945, the day before he broke out of Hitler's Chancellery building in Berlin and stormed out and took on the Russians single-handed with one Tommy gun in his hands, and lasted a couple of minutes, I suppose, before he was struck down. And he wrote this letter to his wife, which she showed me, his widow. And it was a letter saying just that. National Socialism was a great creed, and the trouble is it was been screwed up by a number of the top people who were in charge, because otherwise it was great. When you begin to understand that, you can understand why somebody like Rudolf Hess was different, because he was a good Nazi. He was the good guy. It's not just David Irving saying this. I mean, this is commonly accepted, that he was the good guy. When anything went wrong in National Socialist Germany, people wrote to Rudolf Hess as Deputy Führer, Deputy of Adolf Hitler, which was his rank by the time the war broke out. Stellvertreter des Führers. They would write to Rudolf Hess and ask him to look into this matter. The local Gauleiter, the local police chief, the local governor, whatever. All of them got their jobs because they were Nazis, but they were, some of them, corrupt. And then the local public got fed up with this corruption and brutality, and they would write to Rudolf Hess. And he wouldn't just file the letters away, he would look into it and take action. In fact, to such an extent that he'd do that until he did that right up to the day of his departure from Germany in 1941. 4 years later, when he is being put on trial for crimes against humanity and crimes against peace, the American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert H. Jackson, I greatly admire, he sent somebody to investigate Rudolf Hess's papers, find out what kind of a criminal he was. Robert H. Jackson, I knew his son, Bill Jackson. He rose, in fact, Robert H. Jackson, he was a simple idealist. He rose to the highest position in the legal system in the United States, the Supreme Court of Justice in Washington. He never studied law at university. He, rather like me, I never studied history. I couldn't remember dates. Robert Jackson never studied law. He taught it to himself, fighting eventually a famous legal action against Sacco and Vanzetti was his case, I think, anarchists. And he went on then, Truman appointed him Chief Justice, Chief Prosecutor for the Nuremberg trials. And he sent an American Army lieutenant to raid Rudolf Hess's house in Bavaria in 1945, see what papers they could find to assist the prosecution. And then Jackson's papers, which his son made available to me for my book on the Nuremberg trials, Nuremberg, the Last Battle. In his papers, I found the letter that this American lieutenant, Army Lieutenant Eric Lippman of Florida, he wrote to Jackson saying, I've spent a day or two in the Rudolf Hess house in Hinterlang in Bavaria, and this guy shouldn't be on trial. He doesn't deserve to be on the list. He is a decent Nazi. People turned to him for assistance when they were being maltreated by the National Socialists, and Rudolf Hess always provided succor. He could be relied on to lend an ear. In fact, Rudolf Hess became known as the Wailing Wall of the Nazi movement. That you could go to him and pray for assistance, and Rudolf Hess would act. Lippmann, the letter, I found it in Jackson's papers, and I quote it in the book, because it gives us a pretty good picture. This isn't just a madman, the Holocaust and all the other smears that the Jews and other people have attached to my name, who's saying this. This is something which even their own people found to be true once they saw Rudolf Hess's papers. Because all Rudolf Hess's papers were in the family house in Hinterlang, Bavaria. In fact, years later, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s by now, I think it was, Rudolf Hess's son, Wolf Rudiger, said, Mr. Irving, how would you like to see my father's papers? And unwittingly I said, well, are there any? He said, yes, yes. My mother has all my father's papers. By that time, Rudolf Hess was dead. Ilse Hess, the widow, had all the papers up in her bedroom in the house in Hinterlang, still there ever since the American Army lieutenant had been there. And he said, but you won't let anybody see them. And Wolf says, but Mr. Irving, I'll make an exception for you. If you would like to move into our guest room down in the basement for a week or two, I will bring the files down to you, 2 or 3 at a time, and you can read them. I said, Wolf, I'll go one stage further than that. I won't just read them, I will inventory them for you. I'll make a list of everything there is there. I was writing my Dr. Joseph Goebbels biography at the time, so I used quite a lot of those papers in the Goebbels biography. 70 or 80 ring binders, papers going right back to the beginning of the Nazi movement, historic, enormously valuable. If you go to my website and you type in, there was an address /history, I think, /Hess, to capital H and capital H, and you'll find, I put the entire inventory on there for people to see. I mentioned that because just about 2 months ago, a German historian, Volker Ulrich, has announced that he has found the Rudolf Hess papers. He's full of praise, he's full of self-praise for having found all this stuff. And he is the first person to have used them. So I put that little Der Spiegel interview on my front page and said, well, yes, you were the first, apart from me, 1983, in fact, 23 years before you. Where are they now? These thousands of pages of historic. Well, I can tell you where they are. They're in government archives. Not the German government archives. Wolf Rudiger Hess donated them to the Swiss government archives. They're in Bern, in the Swiss government archives, the papers of Rudolf Hess. What a slap in the face for the Germans. But I'm not surprised. And of course, he could not know, being at that time still alive, that only this year, the same German government has ordered the Rudolf Hess grave site dug up. The family plot in Wunsiedel has now been dug up, and all the stones and markers and epitaphs have been removed, and the remains have been cremated and scattered to the winds in an attempt to stamp out this extraordinary movement for which 48 million people voted in 1938. You can't do it like that. It's not as simple as that. You've got to do better. If you can do better than them, if you can build the autobahns and create full employment and do all these things that the National Socialist movement managed to do, then you've got a chance of stamping out the memory. Otherwise, you haven't. You don't do it by digging up bodies and digging up graves and destroying and crushing the gravestones. Wolf Rudiger Hess, the son, did me a great favor by letting me see those papers. His father was an extraordinary character. He spent half his life in prison. Half of that prison time in solitary confinement as a punishment for what he attempted to do in 1941. Rudolf Hess had emerged from Landsberg prison with Hitler. He'd been set free slightly before Hitler, in fact. And he turned his hand to helping rebuild the Nazi Party, shattered by the imprisonment of its leaders. And Rudolf Hess, over the years, wrote letters to his parents, who were living in Egypt. And we opened all those letters, we steamed them open and photographed the contents, sealed them again and handed them on to the parents in Egypt, which is how I know what the letters contained, because those letters, the photographic copies, are in the British government archives now. Quite a lot of stuff about Rudolf Hess is in the British government archives, but not everything. Quite a lot of stuff about his mysterious end has vanished. Quite a lot of stuff about his missing years while he was held in Secret Service captivity in Britain has also vanished. Now, I'll mention later on, or possibly in the discussion period that we'll have later on, I'll mention what my theories are about what's in those missing pages. One thing is quite plain. Rudolf Hess wasn't a Nazi in the typical sense that we know the Nazis now, vicious, anti-Semitic, brutal, and all the rest. He had sided with Hitler in many respects against the anti-Semitism of the anti-Jewish movements. This is where we start treading on, not on thin ice, but on different ice, because when I say straight away that Adolf Hitler became more and more anti-Nazi as the war approached, you'll be baffled. Until I remind you, of course, that from the day the war broke out, you won't see Adolf Hitler wearing the brown party uniform ever again. From the day war broke out on September the 1st, 1939, Hitler put on his field grey uniform and with the one Iron Cross medal that he was awarded in World War I, and he continued to wear that until the last day of his life. He never again wore the Nazi Party uniform. He didn't like the Nazi Party. He saw all sorts of wrongs. He saw the wrongs that the ordinary members of the public saw, the little Hitlers, as they were called, by us, tramping around in Europe, arrogating themselves all sorts of unconstitutional powers and being generally brutal and bullying. Hitler didn't like that because of the damage it was doing to Germany's name. And the fact that he took the uniform off at the first opportunity is one little proof of it. Another little proof of it is that when Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland in 1941, and Martin Bormann, his previous deputy, took over as head of the Nazi Party. Martin Bormann came to see Hitler, and Hitler's private secretary, Christa Schröder, who was, as you know, a good friend of mine, one of the four secretaries, Hitler said to Christa Schröder, Hitler said to Martin Bormann, in Christoph Schroeder's hearing, when Bormann said, "My Führer, what instructions do you have for me now?" And Hitler replied to Martin Bormann, "Herr Bormann, only one instruction, keep the Nazi Gauleiters off my back. Keep the Nazi Gauleiters off my back." It's exactly the same in German. And that sentence says it all. They were a nuisance to Hitler, but he couldn't do without them. They'd helped him into power, they'd helped him into office, just as anti-Semitism had helped him into power and helped him into office. But now he was in power, he didn't really need them anymore. They were okay, they were running the country, they were the police chiefs, they were the Gauleiters, they were the local district governors. They provided the chieftains for all the provinces he then conquered in the east. But he didn't need the Nazi Party. And there's more and more evidence of that. For example, in 1936, when the first Jewish outrages began, you know, not the anti-Jewish outrages, but the Jewish outrages. I know about this because I've been writing my Heinrich Himmler biography, the chief of the SS, for the last 15 years now. Been dragging on, largely because I now have to do tours like this to keep myself afloat and disseminate the products. But this gives me the chance also to visit strange countries and find extraordinary collections of documents. For example, 3 or 4 days ago I was in New England, just outside Boston, where there's a museum you've never heard of, a private museum run entirely by a multi-millionaire. He has the most extraordinary documents. He's got the piece of fabric from the sofa where Hitler shot himself, with the blood trickling down the sofa. Is identical to the fabric which is in the photograph published by Life magazine at that time, although the GIs investigating Hitler's bunker didn't realize this was the actual sofa where it happened. I know that from Otto Günscher, because he was in that room. He's got this museum, he's got papers and diaries and documents. He's got the original Munich Agreement of 1938, but it's the original draft which has been amended everywhere by Adolf Hitler in his handwriting, and with comments by the British ambassador in the margin, things like that. He has this extraordinary museum filled with hundreds of thousands of pages of papers, which I've been able to use. Then I went to Moscow, of course, where the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, captured the files of their rivals, the German Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Reichssicherheitshauptamt, you can translate that as the Homeland Security Agency, can't you, really? It is the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Well, no, Homeland Security Main Agency. Anyway, the KGB got all those papers, the papers of Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. And a very odd thing becomes plain to you when you go there with a pure brain like mine, because I haven't been taught history. I haven't learned history. I've not been taught how to think about history. So I go there with a pure brain, that is an unwritten script in my brain, and you're capable of coming up with strange answers. You read through all the papers of Reinhard Heydrich and the SS and the Gestapo, which are in the Moscow archives. You realize that they're not worried about the Jews until 1936. The Jews don't figure on their horizon at all as enemies. In fact, it took President Putin only a month or two ago to remind the world that when the Bolsheviks came to power, the Jewish Bolshevik regime was originally 85% Jewish. All the top 500 or 600 leaders of the Moscow regime were Jews. And Putin, for some reason, which I still haven't yet deduced, thought it was a good time to remind the world of this little statistical fact, which not many people know about. But there it is again, in Heydrich's papers, there is the list of all the 85%, the 500 top Jews. Now, the ones who are not Jewish are printed in capital letters, and the ones who are Jewish are printed in regular script. I didn't know that either. But now here comes a statistic which is extraordinary. That is, until then, 1936, the main enemy regarded by the Gestapo as you making card indexes on them and keeping them under supervision, and you're listening to their telephones and everything. The main enemy was what is referred to as Die Reaktion, reactionaries, which is a rather vague kind of all-embracing title. Followed by number 2 enemy is the Catholic Church. The files there are full of wiretaps on the leading Catholic clergy, particularly in Bavaria, who are beginning to get mutinous. Followed enemy number 3 was the Protestant Church, the Evangelische Kirche, followed by number 4, the Freemasons, and it isn't until you come down to position number 7 on the list you reach the Jews. The international Jewish community are regarded way down the list, number 7, as being an enemy. They didn't figure on the horizon. I think that the Nazis hadn't really figured out where the real danger to them was coming from, and vice versa, of course. But then along came the Zionists early in 1936 and decided it needed to stir things up, because the SS and the Zionists were hand in glove. Adolf Eichmann's papers, which I picked up in Buenos Aires a few years ago, They make this quite plain, that he and the Zionists were working very closely together. In fact, he went to Israel once, went to Palestine to see the lie of the land. The Zionists wanted the Jews out, and the SS wanted the Jews out also. The Zionists wanted the Jews into Palestine, and the SS wanted the Jews out anywhere they would go, anywhere where they would be accepted. And so long as they were living peacefully in Germany, then neither side was happy. The SS wanted to prevent any kind of assimilation going on between the Jews and the German people. And the Zionists equally wanted to stop the assimilation because that was spoiling their long-term ambitions in Palestine. And so the SS and the Zionists began cooking up various plots. And right about the beginning of 1936, you'll see where this fits in with Rudolf Hess in a minute. Right about the beginning of 1936, you see that the Zionists then begin a campaign of assassination against the Nazis, picking out one or two top Nazis and killing them. The first case was in January 1936, when a Jew called David Frankfurter, who was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in a Swiss court for the murder, he murdered a Nazi official, a man living in Switzerland, who had arrogated himself the position or airs of being the top Nazi in Switzerland, a man called Wilhelm Gustloff. A bit of recognition there. It's a name, Wilhelm Gustloff. We didn't know that he was the victim of a Jewish assassination plot. Wilhelm Gustloff, his name, he was then buried, given a state funeral in Switzerland, in northern Germany, in Schwerin rather. And a cruise liner was named after him, the Wilhelm Gustloff, one of the famous Nazi working class cruise liners, which were luxury cruise liners that were built by the biggest trade union in the world, the German Labour Front. Half a dozen of these cruised around the Baltic, taking workers on free or cheap paid holiday cruises. One of the things the Nazis did for the workers, which is why the workers then flocked en masse into the ranks of the brown Nazi party and left the Communist Party, because the Communists were not interested they were just interested in exploiting the workers. Whereas National Socialism was a socialist movement, but it was nationalist. It wasn't internationalist like the Marxist movement. That's the difference. That's why Hitler's movement was popular. The Wilhelm Gustloff was one of their best and biggest liners. It was launched soon after his death, given his name, and it cruised the Baltic with thousands of happy German workers until finally it met an end in January 1945, when it was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine as part of the war, carrying 11,500 refugees, all of whom drowned. I mean, you heard about the Titanic. You've heard music about the Titanic. You've watched films about the Titanic with about 1,000 people, 1,500 people drowned in 1912. You don't see films about Wilhelm Gustloff, though, with 11,500 refugees drowned on a cruise liner sunk by the Soviets when the war was ended. You're beginning to see how history tends to list like a torpedoed cruise liner. Leans towards the left. The right wingers get put in prison, and the left wingers get all the glory. That's the Wilhelm Gustloff, murdered by the Jews in 1936, and Adolf Hitler ordered there were to be absolutely no reprisals whatsoever against the Jewish community. I know that. Rudolf Hess signed the document on his headed notepaper. The Führer has ordered there are to be no recriminations or reprisals against the German Jewish community on account of the assassination of Wilhelm Gustloff. And the same thing happened again 2 years later. 2 years later, a strange case. A young, deranged Jew. Well, the Jews say he was deranged, as they always do, I suppose. He was deranged. A man called Herschel Greenspan, possibly related to the later head of the Federal Bank, I don't know. But Herschel Greenspan put on an expensive coat and put an expensive gun in his pocket and worked his way into the German embassy in Paris and shot the deputy ambassador, the first secretary, a man called Ernst von Rath. Shot him dead. He died 3 days later in hospital. Nobody knows where Greenspan got the money from. Previously, he was penniless. He was living below the radar of the Paris police, an illegal immigrant into the city. He'd been, deportation notice had been served on him, but he was still continuing to live there in the city, absolutely penniless. His parents were living somewhere in Germany, heading for Poland. And he managed to get enough money to buy an expensive gun and to buy an expensive coat, otherwise he wouldn't have got past the portiere at the German embassy. There's been all sorts of suppositions about where the money came from. I personally think it came from a body called LICRA, which is the equivalent in Paris of the Anti-Defamation League. It was a body called the League Against and the International League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism. Their headquarters was just around the corner from where he lived and where he got no doubt the money to carry out this outrage. There had already been pogroms in Germany earlier in 1938, in June 1938, which nobody now seems to remember, but if you read my Goebbels book, the biography there, you'll find the full details about these pogroms, these anti-Jewish pogroms in Berlin, which Goebbels had frantically tried to start and stir up, until the word came from Hitler himself down in Bavaria. He said these outrages and disturbances against the Jews in Berlin and the rest of Germany are to stop immediately on orders from the Führer. In the KGB files, there's the actual order, the intervention from the Führer. Again, it's not quite what you've been told in school in this country or elsewhere. Hitler intervening the whole time to stop nasty things happening to the Jews. And on this particular night, after M. Samrat had been assassinated in the Paris embassy, Goebbels really went to town, and he started an immense outrage against the Jews up and down the whole of Germany and Austria. And eventually the chief of the Gestapo telephoned Reinhard Heydrich, who was in Munich at that time, and Gestapo Chief Müller telephoned Heydrich and said, we've got to find out what's happening here because synagogues are on fire, the whole country. Hundreds of synagogues are burning, thousands of Jewish businesses and stores are being set on fire, thousands of Jews have been attacked, 60 or 70 have been murdered already during the night. Heydrich immediately in the bar, the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich, turned to Himmler's chief of staff, Karl Wolff. He said, Herr Wolff, we had to find out whether the Führer has authorized this outrage or not. That's what Gestapo Chief Müller asks us to do, because obviously if the Führer has authorized this disturbance against the Jews as a reprisal, then we keep out of it. On the other hand, we're the chief of police. It's your job to step in and stop it. So Karl Wolff told me all this, Chief of Himmler's chief of staff, and he's written about it in several manuscripts. He went over to see Himmler. It was the 9th of November 1923, the big anniversary, the anniversary of the famous failed putsch in Munich. Himmler was waiting with Adolf Hitler at Hitler's apartment, because at midnight, on the stroke of midnight, they were both going to turn up in the center of the town in Munich for the midnight swearing in of the latest SS recruits, a very dramatic, formal ceremony in the center of Munich. Thousands of SS recruits, all measured for height and immaculately dressed and standing rock still with their uniforms, were waiting to be sworn in to swear the oath on Adolf Hitler, and Hitler would take the oath on the stroke of midnight. They were waiting in the town square, and at 11:30 that evening, Karl Wolff says, he went over to see Himmler at Hitler's headquarters, at Hitler's apartment in Prinz-Eugenenstrasse, Regentenplatz in Munich. He knocked on the door, Himmler inside talking with Hitler, passing the time of day, little chit-chat. Here's the knock on the door. Annie Winter, Hitler's housekeeper, who's provided most of the stuff in this museum in Boston. Extraordinary stuff that's there. Annie Winter at the door says, yes, and she hears Karl Wolff's voice saying, is the Reichsführer here, Heinrich Himmler? Yes, he's here talking with the Führer. I have to see him immediately. And then Karl Wolff comes in, see Himmler, and says, what is it, Wolffchen? And Karl Wolff says, the Gestapo Chief Müller, Gruppenführer Müller, reported that there are outrages up and down the length and breadth of Germany and Austria. They started several hours ago, synagogues on fire, buildings being burned to the ground, Jews being attacked everywhere. Himmler's response can be heard by Hitler. Himmler says, Gottes Willen, for God's sake, and I'm the chief of police. That's his response. And he's just going on leave that day, in fact, for a month leave. I mean, all this gives you a slightly different picture of who's behind what's going on that night. And that night, at 2:30 in the morning, Rudolf Hess, who's in Munich also, issues a teleprinter signal to every Gauleiter, to every Nazi governor in the whole of Germany, just 2.5 lines long, as Deputy Führer. I can tell you what the content is, I know by heart. Auf allerhöchsten Befehl, on orders from the very highest level, there are to be no acts of outrage or no acts of arson or outrages of any kind whatsoever against Jewish property or buildings. Orders up from the very highest level. That's going to be Adolf Hitler himself, of course, because Hitler's the deputy, Hess is the deputy. And then once again, Rudolf Hess is stepping in to see that ugly things don't happen to the Jews. None of this was available at the Nuremberg trials, because the Nuremberg trials were very one-sided. They collected prosecution documents, and the defense documents had by and large not been published. I found these documents in the Berlin Document Center in Berlin. A friend of mine ran the Berlin Document Center, Richard Bauer, long deceased. He gave me copies of these documents, which is how I know this happened. And it fits in with exactly what Lieutenant Eric Lippmann reported to Justice Jackson. This is a good guy. He tried to stop things happening. But he became aware as the years went on that he was no longer the keynote speaker. Once the war began, Hitler was surrounded entirely by generals and admirals, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. The party was very seldom allowed in to see Hitler. Martin Bormann was the voice of the party, and Hitler had said to Bormann, "Keep the Gauleiters off my back." He had no time for the Nazi party. The war had now begun, and Hitler was the warlord, and he was going to be the warlord for as long as he could. And that's why we begin to see the seeds of the Rudolf Hess tragedy. Once he'd been the second man in Germany after Hitler. Now he's dimly aware that even if Hitler dies, he won't be the successor. The successor will be Hermann Goering. There's been a law passed, secret law passed, nominating Hermann Goering as the deputy, as the successor, in the event of Hitler's death. So Rudolf Hess is really a man without a cause. He looks around for a cause. He's no longer the keynote speaker because they no longer have the big rallies. He looks around for a cause that he can make his own, and there's nothing happening. The war has begun. Hitler is away at the fighting front. He's got his headquarters far away, one headquarters in France, another headquarters in the Low Countries. August 1940, he's given orders for a big new headquarters to be built in East Prussia, which is one I visit every year now with a tour party, the Wolf's Lair, because he's going to attack Russia as soon as he can. That's what his life's ambition is. He's got no time for the party. The war has broken out on September the 1st, 1939, and of course school children from this point on are given a totally wrong picture of what happened. If you ask an average school child what happened then, they'll say, well, after Hitler had declared war and attacked his neighbors and was preparing to fulfill his life's ambition of killing 6 million Jews in the gas chamber at Auschwitz, that's basically the picture they have. And instantaneously, with the declaration of war, Hitler began bombing civilian capitals around Europe, massive attacks on London, what the British called the Blitz, and all this. That's not what happened at all. First of all, we British declared war on Germany. The French declared war on Germany after he had attacked Poland. He had attacked Poland. I'm not going to get into the reasons for his attack on Poland. But you have to remember, we declared war on Germany. We started bombing German towns immediately, doing quite a lot of physical damage on German towns. Hitler ordered a complete embargo on bombing London. And that embargo stayed in force for the next 12 months. Historians don't pay attention to what that meant. The German Air Force is fighting a war with both hands tied behind its back. It was able to attack the ports and military installations and airfields and radar stations in southern England. It was able to attack the oil refineries as long as they were along the coast or the rivers where there's no danger of damage being done to civilians. But totally banned from attacking the enemy capital. It's unthinkable. But that's how it stayed. The embargo on bombing London stayed in force until the end of August 1940. However, Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister on May the 10th, 1940, and he had exactly the opposite considerations. He knew that his days as Prime Minister were numbered. He'd come into office as Prime Minister through a fluke, through his own fault, in fact. Neville Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister, was a man of peace, who would, like Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain had avoided bombing civilian targets. But Neville Chamberlain had been thrown out of office because of the military fiasco in Norway, which was actually Winston Churchill's fault as First Lord of the Admiralty. So Neville Chamberlain was thrown out. Winston Churchill found himself appointed Prime Minister, largely through his own failures. If the war had ended in the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill would have gone down in history forgotten as a total failure. Everything he turned his hands to had turned to ashes. The inverse Midas touch, you might call it. He was in the World War I and between the wars and in the start of World War II, everything that he commanded was a disaster. World War I, Gallipoli. My father was aboard the battleships bombarding the beaches at Gallipoli. Battle of Jutland. My father was aboard one of the battleships at the Battle of Jutland, May the 31st, 1916, anniversary coming up soon. In fact, I think if my father could really have known somebody who had actually fought at the Battle of Trafalgar with Admiral Nelson, probably, if you think back far enough. My father was in the Battle of Jutland, anyway. This extraordinary grand fleet action where the two fleets, the German fleet and the British fleet, sallied forth into the middle of the North Sea, tending to do damage to each other, rather like the Battle of Midway in 1942. But unfortunately, the two fleets lost each other and kind of sailed past each other and did a bit of damage and dented each other's warships, and I think they knocked out 5 of our battle cruisers in very short, within 5 minutes, in fact. So Admiral Beatty uttered the famous exclamation saying, "What's the matter with my bloody battle cruisers today?" after he had lost 5 in front of his binoculars in the space of 5 minutes because of the weak armour plate on the decks. And then World War II, Churchill had sent the expeditionary force to France and seen it been thrown out. Here he is, Prime Minister since May the 10th, and only 2 weeks after becoming Prime Minister, he's issuing an order to Lord Gort, who's the General in Command of the British Expeditionary Force in France. I've got a copy of it from the widow of the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud. It's not in the British archives, but I've got a copy of it from Paul Reynaud's widow, because his papers were in the French National Archives, and with her one remaining arm, she signed a letter I brought authorizing me to see the papers in the French National Archives. And there's this Churchill order to Lord Gort saying, "You are to advance on the beaches of Dunkirk." That's a choice of words, I suppose. They're saying advance on the beaches at Dunkirk rather than saying retreat to the beaches. You will advance on the beaches at Dunkirk, and you will not tell the Belgians on your right or the French on your left what you are doing. And that is really scummy behavior, to leave your allies in the lurch and head for the beaches as fast as you can. And Churchill had masterminded that, so this is a final fiasco. If the war had ended now, as lots of people wanted it to, he would have gone in history as a failure. Lots of people wanted the war to end. 3 members of his own cabinet wanted peace. Usually, the public wants peace. They're fed up after, it's happening in the United States. People are fed up with being led into needless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now you're going to be going to Iran if you're not careful too, and John Bolton, the guy who's behind it all. Look him up in Wikipedia. You find out that he was a conscientious objector while he was at university. They're the most belligerent. John Bolton, next time you see him on television with that ridiculous moustache and the ridiculous hair, remember that you're being lectured by a conscientious objector on the need for the United States to go to war in the Middle East yet again. And in England, there was a peace movement. They demonstrated in Downing Street. They demonstrated in Downing Street because in those days there were no gates at either end. Mrs. Thatcher put those gates up in Downing Street. And I think that the Prime Minister should not be frightened of her own people. That's a sign that you're frightened of your own people. But of course, it's years since your Prime Ministers or Presidents were able to drive around in open cars like Adolf Hitler. You see him in A Triumph of the Will and Victory of Faith. The last American president who tried driving around in an open car was JFK, of course. But I don't think he'd advise people to try that one again. You've got to be really popular before you take that. As Adolf Hitler said to his private staff, he said, "My protection is my popularity with the German people." He said, "I take a risk, I know it." And there were lots of people out there who tried to kill him, but they all failed. And Margaret Thatcher obviously was number 2. She put these iron gates at both ends of number 10. But in 1940, the gates weren't there. You could walk down to number 10, Downing Street, and stand outside with the placards and posters and scream against the war and scream your hatred against the Prime Minister. And this rather got on Churchill's nerves. He knew that the peace movement could be got rid of, but not so long as there was peace. Only if the war started, if the real bombing war started. The bombing war would put immediate end to the peace movement, because that's how the British are. Once you're attacked, then you fight back. The British march to the sound of gunfire. People say, "Why did I take legal action against Deborah Lipstadt?" Well, you march to the sound of gunfire, no matter what the outcome. And that's what I did. And Winston Churchill decided that he had to have the bombing war start as soon as he possibly could. There were 3 reasons to start the bombing war. You're looking for the history of who started saturation bombing, and it's Winston Churchill. The answer is quite obviously Winston Churchill, but he had 3 reasons, one of them good and 2 of them bad. He wanted the Americans to see German bombers destroying London, his own capital, because this would surely drag the Americans into his war. The Americans are nice people, and they wouldn't stand for seeing the other English-speaking peoples being hammered into the ground by Nazi bombers. Secondly, the airfields and radar stations in southern England were taking a hammering from the German Air Force, and they were on the point of collapsing, and they were vital to British air defences. If Churchill could persuade the bombers to attack a different target, an easier target than the radar stations and fighter defence stations, then that was a sound tactical objective. But the third objective he had, of course, was to put an end to the peace movement in Britain. 3 cabinet ministers in his own cabinet wanted peace. Lord Halifax, the foreign minister, Neville Chamberlain, of course, the outgoing prime minister, they wanted peace. Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian, great newspaper magnate, I used to know him. He was also in favour of peace. He was pro-German, yes, Lord Beaverbrook. He was pro-German. In fact, you'll see when he comes to visit Rudolf Hess in British captivity, there's a transcript of their entire conversation in the British Secret Archives. And that reveals exactly what Lord Beaverbrook's opinions really are. They're not just being faked for the benefit of his august visitor. These are Beaverbrook's own views. I know that from his private correspondence too. He's a good guy, Lord Beaverbrook. He's one of my favourites. One of my other favourites in history is Joseph P. Kennedy. Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the president, much more interesting than, but his papers are all locked up in Massachusetts, in Boston, in the Kennedy Library, and particularly his private diary. He was the ambassador in Britain, which is why I took it when I wrote my book, Churchill's War. I spent more effort than on anything else trying to make a complete set of all Kennedy's telegrams from London back to Washington. They are hilarious to read and full of correct opinions. Correct in my opinion. Not correct now, of course. Totally incorrect, which is why I rather like them. So the war broke out, there had been no bombing, and now Churchill decided to end that. The difficulty was that Adolf Hitler had ordered no bombs falling on London, a total embargo on the Luftwaffe attacking London. No matter what Churchill did, Hitler would not be lured into attacking London. All this continued until the end of August 1940. And we then find Rudolf Hess coming out of oblivion and being yanked back onto the centre of the stage again. At the end of 1940, the German Air Force was beginning to crush the British defences, although there was no intention of attacking, there was no intention of invading Britain. This is another of the schoolboy lessons that are total lies. I've read all the internal files of the German Air Force, the German Navy. Hitler actually told a German admiral halfway through August 1940, I have no intention of invading Britain. The whole of this sabre rattling along the English Channel coast is purely to distract attention from what we're doing in the east, we're getting ready to attack Russia. But the British either fell for it or knew what the truth was and kept silent about it. I think Churchill knew what the truth was because he was reading the Enigma code messages. One German bomber, part of a squadron flying up the Thames to attack the oil refinery at Rotherhithe on the Thames, lost its way, flew too far up the Thames, one loop too many, and dropped its bombs inside the borders of Greater London and thereby attacked London. It was an accident about August the 23rd of 1940. The crew of that bomber, that German bomber, were actually court-martialed for having made such a stupid error. They were put on court-martial for it. The bomber killed nobody, did very little damage, but it was just what Churchill had been waiting for that Saturday evening. And on the Sunday morning, he was out at his country house, of course, in Chequers, the Prime Minister's country establishment. Churchill picked up the telephone at 9:10 in the morning and telephoned Bomber Command headquarters. He said, I want a mass air raid against the centre of Berlin tonight by 100 bombers. I know this because I found the war diary of Bomber Command headquarters at High Wycombe. Notably, Churchill is at his country house. He's not talking, he's not with his cabinet. He's not discussed it with his cabinet. He's not discussed it with the chiefs of staff. It's his own private decision. He picks up the phone at 9:10 that Sunday morning and orders a mass attack on Berlin that night. Bomber Command quite rightly points out, the Commander-in-Chief, he says, you do realize if you attack Bomber Command, then the embargo will have been broken, and they will attack, they will feel quite right to retaliate against London, and the consequences on civilian casualties and damage will be very substantial. And Churchill just twinkles, because this is what he wants. Bomber Command headquarters then points it out. They say, you do realize, of course, that the German bomber airfields are now in France, and 150 miles flying time from London, whereas our airfields are up in East Anglia and over 1,000 miles from Berlin. So they're not going to be able to get to Berlin and back at this time of year, in August. They're going to come back in broad daylight, and they're going to suffer heavy casualties among the bombers. Churchill says that doesn't matter. The air raid goes ahead. So he's overruled his own high command, and the bombing raid goes ahead that night, and some damage is done to Berlin, but less than he would hope, because British bombers weren't very good at finding their targets at night at that time. In 1941, RAF Bomber Command then found out that their blind bombing at night was very inaccurate. You couldn't just fly 1,000 miles in one direction and drop your bombs and assume that you were hitting Berlin. It could be anywhere, over a wide arc of countryside. But the intention was quite obvious. Hitler immediately flew back from Berchtesgaden, from his country house, to Berlin. As the German High Command War Diary says, the Führer has returned to Berlin because bombing raids on Berlin have now started, and he wants to be with his people. Churchill did the opposite. We later on find out when the bombing of London then becomes intense. Churchill always leaves London late in the evening, goes out through the back garden gate at number 10 Downing Street. It's still there, you can see it. Leads out onto Horse Guards Parade, the big parade ground behind, where his Daimler car is parked with his driver. He says, driver, take me out to Oxfordshire. And he drives 100 miles west to Ditchley Park in Oxfordshire, where the estate of the Conservative Member of Parliament, Ronald Tree, a big country house, wealth millionaire Conservative Member of Parliament, one of Churchill's friends, and Churchill spends the night there because he's safe 100 miles away from London. The following morning he then returns to London, puts on his uniform of an Air Commodore in the Royal Air Force. Yeah, that's the uniform he wears in the photographs when he's visiting the East End of London. That's been bombed, the working class areas of London. And he drives around or is driven around the working class areas of London that have suffered that weight of the attack, wearing this spurious Air Force uniform, giving the V sign, smoking a cigar, and all the workers cheering him and waving their flags and saying, "Good old Winnie, if you can take it, we can take it too. Give it back." Of course, very few people know this, but I rented his desk diaries. I paid £5,000 many years ago to rent his desk diaries for the entire war years, which list exactly where he is. And if you compare that with the air raids on London, and you know that 85% of the time he knew when London was going to be the target, you suddenly realize what he's doing. I also got the private diary of his private secretary, John Martin, Sir John Martin, as he later became. And there too, it's particularly on the night of the air raid on Coventry, you find out what Churchill was really up to that night. You see, he had three ways of knowing when London was going to be the target of Luftwaffe bombing raids. There was decoding. In June 1940, we had broken the German Air Force operational Enigma code. It was called the Enigma. And we knew from their messages when they were going to be attacking London. Sometimes the Germans were unfair. They didn't actually say London or Birmingham. They would say, "We're going to be attacking Umbrella." And Umbrella was Birmingham, because Umbrella was Birmingham. Chamberlain was always associated with Birmingham, the Chamberlain family, and Neville Chamberlain always walked around with his umbrella, his brolly. And so the Nazis would call it Umbrella. It's Birmingham. But most of the time he knew from the code breaking. Or there were the blind bombing beams. The Germans had two blind bombing beam systems, one called Knickerbein, or dogleg, and the other called Ex-Gerät. The idea was, which is slightly more advanced than Knickerbein, the idea was that you would put on what was rather like a blind landing beam at an airport, except there would be two of them, and they would intersect over the target. And the British were clever enough that afternoon, when they knew that the blind bombing beams had been switched on about 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Germans would calibrate them, make sure they were exactly over. The British would would send up a Spitfire or Hurricane, and it would go snooping along one beam until it found where it was intersecting with the other beam. Oh, Coventry or Liverpool. So we knew what was going to be the target that night. Or there was one final way, and that was the weather. Again, the weather. The Germans didn't have a level playing field. The weather was in our favor. The weather in Europe goes from west to east. So we knew what the weather was going to be over any target at any time of day. The Germans were in the east, they didn't know they had. So they would send a long-range plane out around the British Isles out to the Atlantic, pick up the weather details out there, what was going to be over England that night. And but we knew then, by picking up the radio transmission of that weather plane, we knew that tonight was going to be the night of another big air raid. That's how Churchill knew. And so this bombing war began. He sent 4 raids to Berlin. And Adolf Hitler didn't do him the favor of retaliating. Must have taken great nerve and great patience. He was in Berlin. He could hear the raids, hear the sirens. He could hear the cry of the Berliners demanding retaliation, but he wasn't going to be taken in like that. Until finally, on September the 4th, he made a final threatening speech in the Berlin Sport Palace, in which he said, if that madman in London attacks Berlin, he doesn't seem to realize that we are much stronger than he is. If he drops 10 tons of bombs, we can drop 100 tons. If he sends 100 bombers, we can send 1,000 bombers. If he says he can damage German cities, then we can wipe out theirs in Britain. Die werden ihre Städte ausradieren. In German, a very famous phrase by Adolf Hitler. And of course, Winston Churchill wasn't the least bit intimidated. This is what he'd been waiting all that time to hear. So he sends that afternoon another mass air raid against Berlin that same night, September the 5th. On the afternoon of September the 6th, we Londoners can hear the sound of the approaching German Air Force coming up the Thames. The entire Air Force, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of bombers, Junkers and Dorniers and Heinkels. The Heinkel bomber, a twin-engine bomber, they were all twin-engine bombers. Had 2 engines that were slightly asynchronous. So you could tell it was a Heinkel because it was the engine note rose and fell. We children, I mean, I was 4 or 5 at that time, in our kindergarten, In the playground, we could look up, we couldn't see them, we could say, oh, that's a Heinkel, or that's a Junker, that's a Dornier. You would know which planes they were. That's the way children are. We weren't the least bit frightened, but it's fascinated, this rising and falling note. Graham Greene wrote a novel actually called Ministry of Fear. It's one of his best novels about, I read it in prison. I had time to read a lot of, when you're in prison, you have a lot of time to read. And there's this, the hero of the book is a little man scampering, running around the English countryside, trying to escape something, and later on we find out that he's wanted for murder. He's murdered his wife. But everywhere he goes at night, he hears the sound of these Heinkel bombers, with the engine note rising and falling, and he imagines it after a time that these bombers are saying, where are you, where are you, where are you, where are you? I remember that, and I thought, oh good Lord, yes, that was just how they sounded, the Heinkel bombers. Finally, the German Air Force attacks London on September the 6th. 6,000 Londoners are killed and injured in that night's air raid, which is just what Churchill wanted. It's the end of the peace movement. There's no question at all this is what he wanted. Every attempt that Adolf Hitler had made to bring Germany's peace offer to the attention of the British had been beaten back by Churchill alone. The German ambassador in Washington, D.C., Hans Thompson, had approached the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, and told the British ambassador of Germany's peace offer. Churchill had intercepted Hans Thompson's message back to Berlin, saying, I did that, and Lord Lothian was very receptive and seemed very keen to follow this up. Churchill immediately read the decoded message, the decode of the German ambassador's message, and sent a message to his Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, saying that it must be no talk whatsoever of any talks of discussion of peace with the Germans. Hitler sent a lawyer then to Stockholm, a lawyer called Ludwig Weishauer, to approach the British ambassador in Stockholm, Victor Mallet. Victor Mallet reported on the German peace offer. Again, Churchill sent a message, a reply saying, you are absolutely forbidden to have any discussions with German emissaries on this topic. It's not what Churchill wanted. He didn't want peace. He wanted to go down in glory. He wanted to go in the history books as Britain's greatest living Englishman. And that's how the British still see it, of course, the World War II. The British have never yet realized that World War II totally bankrupted Britain, that it destroyed our empire, that the man who did this was our hero, Winston Churchill, the grave digger of the empire. The British, if you speak to the British, they have this fond belief that the empire is still out there somewhere. The evidence of the empire is out there is all the tourists who are walking up and down Oxford Street, these black gentlemen, coloured gentlemen, obviously they're from the empire, so the empire is still out there, isn't it? Isn't it? No one's actually... Henry Morgenthau, your Secretary of the Treasury, he visited Churchill in August 1944, and he put this question to Churchill. It's in Morgenthau's diary. He says, I asked the Prime Minister, when he was going to break it to the British people, that he had bankrupted the British Empire with his war. And the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, answered, that is a doleful task, which I shall leave to my successor. and Clement Attlee, I don't think he found out either, because it's been kept secret for many years afterwards. It was kind of masked over by Lend-Lease and all the other things that happened after the war and the Marshall Plan. So the British never realized what the war had cost them, this futile war. The interesting question to me is what would have happened if Rudolf Hess had actually been able to get to the British people and tell them his peace offer. The German peace offer, because it was very magnanimous. Hitler, in fact, had said to his private secretaries after the defeat of France that he wanted nothing from Britain at all. Christa Schroeder, she wrote letters, which I've got, Hitler's private secretary. She's very close to Hitler. Didn't do much typing. Well, she used his typewriter, Hitler's typewriter, to type these letters to a woman friend in Switzerland. And she gave me copies of all these letters. Some of them she'd cut paragraphs out of. She'd actually cut them out with scissors. I don't mind. I don't know what's going on between the two of them, but the historical content is very substantial. I mean, she's very indiscreet, Christa Schroeder. Dear old lady, died in 1983. But she gave me all these letters from my book, Hitler's War. And she says, for example, in 1941, she writes a letter to her friend in Switzerland saying, next week we're going to be attacking Russia. Isn't that exciting? Yeah, exciting, but indiscreet, shall we say. not something, you know. But June the 24th, 1940, when Churchill had just gone to power, she had 2 days after the armistice with France, in fact, June the 24th, 1940, she writes in this letter to her woman friend, she said, I had lunch with the chief today, meaning Hitler. I had lunch with the chief. It was so interesting. He says that women all over Europe now will be so grateful to him that the war has now ended so fast and that all the bloodshed will end because surely the British will now see reason. and withdraw. He wants nothing from Britain or the British Empire. In fact, he's the greatest admirer of the British Empire. She writes in a letter. In fact, he's not prepared to ask for compensation for any of the damage the British have done with their air raids. He's not going to ask. In fact, he says that if anybody outside aggressors should attack the British Empire, including Japan or Russia or Italy, his own allies, then he's prepared to provide German forces to help the British to throw these aggressors out. That man was our enemy, whereas our great ally was your President Roosevelt, who said, May 1942, to Henry Wallace, he said, my great ambition is to see the destruction of the British Empire, beginning with India. He was our ally. You see, this is how children have got it all mixed up at present, because they've been lied to ever since the war is over. They had to be lied to justify the extraordinary cost, same as you're being lied to in America, to justify the cost. I mean, I wonder if there's possibly any link between your vast economic depression at present and these ridiculous wars that you're fighting in the Middle East, which are really no concern of any vital American interest, I would have thought. I have to be careful what I say here, I'm just a visitor. Hitler sent for Rudolf Hess at the end of August 1940, frantic to end the war before it really got out of hand. And he said, Mr. Hess, you have these friends in Britain, don't you? Surely you can contact them in some way and make it plain to them that we want nothing at all from Britain and just want the fighting to stop. Hess, well, yes, he did have friends in Britain. The Duke of Hamilton was one. Duke of Hamilton was one of the leading members of the British aristocracy, very close to the royal family, with a castle in Scotland. He came to Berlin in 1936. He got to know Rudolf Hess there. He's been rather quiet about it ever since then until he died. He not quite sure how much Duke of Hamilton was straightforward and uptight, how much he was concealing, whether he was perhaps a member of the British Secret Service all along or in the pay of the British Secret Service. Was he part of a plot to lure Rudolf Hess away from Germany? All sorts of possibilities. We do know that he lied about how close a friend he was with Rudolf Hess, a very simple reason. Very frequently, what you find when you go through a new collection of records, like the Rudolf Hess papers in that country house in Bavaria, what you find is less important than what you don't find. And I came to the H-file with great interest, because there was the H-file, and I would have expected to find correspondence with the Duke of Hamilton in the H-file. There wasn't, but there was a large empty envelope. Empty envelope typed on the outside was the name Duke of Hamilton, 1938, and it had obviously at one time contained a large portrait photograph, mounted in something or other. But the photograph is now missing. But in 1938, the Duke of Hamilton sent Hess, obviously, a signed portrait photograph as a close friend. He is the guy Rudolf Hess decides now to contact, at Hitler's request. Establish contact with the British, to make it plain to the British people. Go over the head of Winston Churchill. Make it plain to the King of England and the British people that we want nothing at all from Germany. We want nothing at all from Britain, and the war can now end. We're offering them peace. So Rudolf Hess says to Hitler, yes, he'll do what he can. And here's where I have to fault him, because he begins an endless process of getting things right. It's typically German characteristic. Winston Churchill himself once said the Germans are incapable of having a proper revolution, because that would mean you'd have to walk on the grass somewhere. Or on another occasion he said they're incapable of killing somebody because they'd go and get a gun license first. Which is largely true. I mean, if you look at the history of the bomb attempt on Hitler's life in 1944, the entire German general staff failed to kill Hitler, because they were so busy planning and plotting and drawing up timetables and lists of future ministers and arguing over who's going to get which job, that they never actually got down to the job of killing Hitler. And when they did get down to the job of killing Hitler, they bungled it. And that's typically German. Rudolf Hess, he began to write a letter to Britain. But he wants to get it right. It's got to be in proper English. So he thinks around, Gauleiter Ernest Bohler, the chief of the foreign Germans, the chief of the Auslandsorganisation, the foreign organization as it was called. He was born in Britain. Like a lot of people. Winifred Wagner, I knew her too. She was born in Britain. I had to interview, she's the daughter of Richard Wagner, but I had to interview her in German because she couldn't speak any English anymore. Walter von Schirach, his mother was English, or American, almost the same thing. But Ernst Bohler, he was born in Britain. He was born in Bradford. But anyway, Ernst Bohler helps Rudolf Hess to write the letter. And for weeks they adjust every comma and every full stop and the positioning of words to get everything exactly right. And the weeks pass, and it's the end of 1940. And Hitler's forgotten about what he told Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess is down in Munich, and Ernst Bohler is with him working on the letter. Finally, they send off the letter to a woman in Lisbon, in neutral Portugal, who's agreed to forward it to the Duke of Hamilton. So it goes to this woman, a Mrs. Wilson, living in Lisbon, who is actually an agent of the British Secret Service, MI6. So the letter probably never reaches the Duke. At any rate, after the war, he disclaimed any knowledge of the letter. The letter itself, I've seen it. It's in the British Government Archives, in the Public Record Office in Kew, National Archives in Kew. It sets out the German peace offer. They want nothing at all. They're prepared to withdraw the German armed forces from all the countries which they now occupied. Hitler, by that time, in the summer of 1940, occupies the whole of Europe, from northern Norway all the way down to the Spanish frontier. His armies have conquered the lot. He has a huge bargaining position, but he's prepared to withdraw everything, provided he retains the original German provinces that have always been German in history before. So it will be an enlarged... Oh, and he wants a free hand against the Jewish Bolshevik regime in the East. But that's in our interests, I would have thought. Although historians or kind of semi-historians, they interrupt at this point and they say, excuse me, Mr. Irving, you're suggesting that we should have turned over the whole of Eastern Europe to a dictatorship, is that right? Well, yes, we did that precisely in May 1945. We turned over the whole of Eastern Europe to a dictatorship. The difference being in those 5 years that we'd killed 5 million people, we burned them alive in Germany and France and Poland and other cities that we'd bombed. We destroyed Europe's most beautiful cities. We had bankrupted our own empire. All these things, that's the difference from not having accepted the German peace offer, thanks to Winston Churchill's magnificent oratory. So many members of his cabinet wanted to accept the peace. If you look at the records of the British cabinet now, you'll find that these paragraphs have been blanked out even now, years after they should have been opened. The paragraphs where Churchill, we know from private diaries, is discussing with them whether to accept the German peace offer or not. No. Rudolf Hess works on that letter. He waits for an answer from Mrs. Wilson, from the Duke of Hamilton. The answer doesn't come. Weeks pass. He assumes that they're now pondering the letter. They're pondering the German offer. They're all going over it. They're discussing it in cabinet. Clearly, he's going to get a magnificent answer. Rudolf Hess will single-handed have saved the day and have saved the lives of millions. That's the way you think when you're an optimist. I used to write letters to publishers, and I wouldn't get a reply. Then you think, well, that's because Macmillan's, my old publisher, or Weidenfeld, or Hodder & Stoughton, or whoever they are, they're obviously considering and pondering this magnificent offer I've made to them, or a book on Himmler, or Goebbels, or whatever it is. And months pass before you realize that they are not going to reply, that there's not going to be a reply at all, and then you start all over again. Rudolf Hess started all over again. Okay, postal system's not very good. Why don't I just fly there myself? I will land on the landing strip next to the castle of the Duke of Hamilton. I will march up to his gates and I will shake his hand and I'll say, here I am, here's our peace offer. And now tell the British people that we want nothing from them. Then they will have no reason to carry on fighting. That's the dream. He is the man who is no longer in the public eye. He is no longer the keynote speaker, but with one mighty bound, he can get back into the public eye. He will be the man who stopped the war single-handed. And he begins to plot how to get a plane, how to make the flight. And he's not a madman who's making this plot. He's a very clever, dedicated man indeed. He goes to his friend Willy Messerschmitt. I discussed it with Willy Messerschmitt years ago, tall, bald-headed scientist. Messerschmitt, he was the father of the Messerschmitt 109, which is the very fast single-seater fighter plane, daylight fighter plane, which was the workhorse throughout the war years, getting better and better, like the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And he also was the man who designed the Messerschmitt 110, the 110, the twin-engine fighter plane, a heavy fighter, which is much more complicated to fly. It needed a crew of 3. You need a pilot and a co-pilot and an engineer radio operator. And it was heavier to fly and had a shorter range. The Germans weren't really ready for war with Britain, which was a long-range flight. They weren't planning on that. But he says to Willy Messerschmitt, can I have a plane? And Messerschmitt says, well, yes, which one do you want? And Rudolf Hess says, I want the 110, the heavy plane, the 3-man crew. Messerschmitt says, okay, we'll put it on the tab of the German Reich. I mean, it's the deputy Führer, he's presumably able to order planes if he wants. That's what's in Messerschmitt's papers, which we've got in England, in the War Museum, in the archives of the War Museum. Messerschmitt's all his papers, including, I go through them from left to right. I'm not looking for these particular papers, but I went through all Messerschmitt's papers one day, and I found that he In January 1941, he says to his chief designer, Willy Bulker, he says, Mr. Hess has been to me and he says he wants modifications made to the 110 we're turning over to him off the production line. It's going to be have certain important modifications. He wants all the oxygen supply delivered to the pilot's seat because there'll be no co-pilot. He's going on a journey, quite a long journey, but he wants to have the second oxygen supply turned onto his seat. Oh, and he wants to have special radio beacon equipment installed, blind landing equipment, special radar equipment, special radio stuff, weather stuff. I forgot to ask him what he wants it for, but no doubt, as he's the Deputy Führer, after all, he knows what he wants it for, and it's all above board. And I suppose years later I thought to myself, wait a minute, that's a letter covering his butt, Messerschmitt's butt, because if things go wrong, then at least he got the letter to prove he didn't know what he was, but he assumed it was because of his high rank as deputy to Adolf Hitler that he was able to order these special things. But I found that letter and I thought, well, we know what the modifications are for, because it is now January 1941. The whole of the war has changed. I mean, Hitler's now got troops fighting in Africa, he's got troops fighting in the Balkans, he's preparing to invade Greece and Yugoslavia. He's no longer concerned with what Britain does. I think he's probably forgotten the conversation he had with Rudolf Hess. But Rudolf Hess hasn't. He lies awake at night dreaming of the flight he's going to make. His bedroom in Bavaria, the walls are covered with maps of Germany and the North Sea, with the route he's going to fly, the beacons that he's already had installed all the way along the route, the radio beacons. He starts getting special weather forecasts delivered to him 3 times a day, the weather over England. And he memorizes these. He's memorizing the route. He's memorizing how to use the equipment. One of the pieces of equipment that landed with him in Scotland in the wreckage was a long cylindrical thing, what the Germans call a Rechenschieber. Okay, I'll translate it. It won't help you younger people. It's a slide rule. Doesn't help young. You see, a slide rule is what you do with your iPhone. Tap, 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 and you get a cosine or logarithm, whatever it is. This is a digital. Imagine a digital iPhone, right? Where you've got rings that you rotate, and you read off along, and you get the cosine or something, which you're going to need when you're doing navigation around the Great Circle. Rudolf Hess is learning how to manipulate all this equipment. In fact, this museum I was in New England, in Boston, 3 days ago, has got the second oxygen supply from the wreckage, the one that he had switched over onto the pilot's seat. All these things he's planning and plotting. He's no fool. He knows he's taking his life in his hands when he does this. And in January, he makes his first attempt, 1941. He sends for his adjutants, Alfred Leitgen and Pinch, the 2 adjutants. And he says, I'm going to go on a bit of a journey, and I'm going to give you a sealed envelope, and when I don't come back after a couple of hours, I want you to take this envelope to the Führer, to Adolf Hitler, and hand it to him. You say, I've gone somewhere, and will he read the letter? That's roughly what we know, because in my latest edition of the book on Rudolf Hess, I've got an appendix which is based on the Gestapo interrogation records of people like Leitgen and Pinch, on Rudolf Hess's private staff, his adjutants and his secretaries and people. The Gestapo interrogated them all very closely after the war, after the flight. And one thing they all wanted to find out was, did the Führer know what you were doing? Because if the Führer didn't know what you were doing, then you're in deep trouble. You were his adjutants, you did nothing to stop it. On the other hand, if the Führer was fully aware of what Rudolf Hess was up to, then we're going to keep well out of it. So that's why the Gestapo went into great detail, questioning all, and those interrogation reports are in California. A guy called Erich von Bensdorf bought them somehow on the auction market. I've read them all. He made very nice copies for me, and I've read them all. I've put them in an appendix in the book. Pinch and Leitgen, they don't ask him where he's planning to go, but all they know is that if he doesn't come back, we've got to deliver the letter to the Führer. But within an hour, there's sound of engines, and the plane lands back on the factory airfield, where he keeps it stored, the Messerschmitt factory airfield in Augsburg in southern Germany, in Bavaria. So the mission's off. He's aborted it for some reason. I don't know why he aborted it, bad weather or bad radar or something. And he then resumes his plotting and looking at the maps on his bedroom wall. He sends for the tailor, and he has he gets measured up for the special uniform he's going to wear, the Luftwaffe uniform. Perhaps he realized as he made the flight he hadn't got the uniform on. And he better get a uniform just in case he does get caught and accused of being a spy. So he has this uniform made until it fits. And the months pass. May the 4th, 1941, he's still not made the flight. He's made a couple of trial flights, and each time he's come back, found something wrong with the plane, perhaps he's got cold feet. The war has now changed. I mean, Hitler's now invaded and conquered Greece and Yugoslavia, and everything has changed. Churchill is still suffering one military fiasco after another. In fact, Churchill doesn't have his first great military victory until May 1941, when he sinks the Bismarck. That's his first gleam of light. May the 4th, 1941, Adolf Hitler makes a famous speech in the Reichstag in which he mocks Winston Churchill. He says that as a soldier, he's as bad a soldier as he is as a politician. As a politician, he's as bad a politician as he is as a soldier. There's no hope for this man. Howls of laughter from the Reichstag, from the members of Parliament. That evening, before Hitler returns to his home, Rudolf Hess comes to see him in his little room up in the Reich Chancellery, and he says, "Mein Führer, a couple of words. Can I have 10 minutes with your time?" "Oh, very well." Mr. Hess says, Hitler, and Hess comes in. Hess says, "I have just one question I want to ask you." I know this because Christa Schröder told me this. Hitler told her afterwards. Hess says to Hitler, "You remember that conversation back in August 1940 about Britain? I'm sure you're thinking about Britain the same now as it was then?" Rather irritably and tiredly, because it had been a long, strenuous speech, Hitler replies to him saying, "Of course it's the same. Why should I think any different?" Hess says, "Thank you. All I wanted to know." He's got permission. He considers that he now has permission to make the flight. He goes back down to Bavaria. He sends for Alfred Pinch, his adjutant. He says, "Herr Pinch, bring your camera." And he puts one leg on the plane of the Messerschmitt 110, putting on his Luftwaffe uniform, and he stands on the wing of the plane. He says, "Mr. Pinch, this day is going to go down in history. Take a photograph." The photograph is there in Rudolf Hess's papers. Alfred Pinch still doesn't understand what all this is about, but the plane takes off. Rudolf Hess flies into the darkness. 2 hours later, he comes back again. The sound of engine notes, the Messerschmitt engine notes, and he lands on the airfield, says nothing to Pinch, takes the letter back from him. He then waits 6 days. May the 10th, 1941, 50 years before I stood next to that uniform. May the 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess climbs back into that plane in the knowledge that it's the night when the German Air Force, the entire German Air Force, is carrying out the heaviest raid of the war on London. Deliberately, it's going to be a farewell attack on London before they secretly go off to the Eastern Front, ready for the attack on Russia. So they're going to leave give the British something to think about. So the entire German Air Force is attacking London that night. Most of the British fighter defences are concentrated around London, fighting off the attack. And word comes to the Duke of Hamilton, the wing commander now in the Royal Air Force, at his fighter squadron near Edinburgh. Word comes that there's one lone plane is crawling up the North Sea. It's broad daylight. There's this Messerschmitt 110 has been sighted coming up the North Sea in a dead straight line, just heading north, ever northwards up the North Sea. He's flown all the way up from Augsburg that afternoon. He's over the North Sea. He's going to fly the same rectangular pattern that he's got marked on the map on the wall in his bedroom until dusk begins to fall, because he's not going to be stupid enough to fly into Scotland in broad daylight. He's going to wait until it's dusk. And the Duke of Hamilton is, by chance, commanding a fighter squadron station at Edinburgh. And he does nothing to shoot this plane down. That's a strange thing. In fact, I've checked all the fighter squadrons in Scotland at that time. None of them scrambled a plane to take down this Messerschmitt. But one of the squadron record book does, I think it's the Duke of Hamilton's record book, does make a comment. It says, very strange for a Messerschmitt 110 to be flying this far north, as though we knew that Hess was coming that night, or somebody knew that Hess was coming that night. But we can't be fully clear because the records are incomplete. Rudolf Hess waits until dusk has fallen. He's now picked up a radio blind bombing beam that he's had switched on to give him the exact location where he's got to turn. And he turns in towards the coast, and he picks up a landmark on the coast, the east coast of Scotland, and then he flies due west across Scotland until he picks up a landmark on the west coast. In this heavy Messerschmitt 110 plane, a 3-man plane, and he's flying it single-handed. Which is no easy achievement for a man of his age. He's age 47. And okay, he was an aviator in World War I, so he's familiar with planes, but not with big modern planes like this and all the equipment he's had to handle at the same time. But he's picked up the blind bombing beam, he's picked up the landmark, he's flown across Scotland to the west coast, picks up a lot of landmarks there, loses height to about 1,000 feet above the ground, and then comes back in following exactly the route that he took across the country until he counts off an exact number of seconds and calculates that he's very close to the castle of the Duke of Hamilton. He turns the plane on its back, undoes the canopy and drops out into the night sky. And he makes his first ever parachute jump in his life. I mean, if one man deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for doing what he did that night, that's this moment. He lands within 2 minutes flying time of the Duke of Hamilton's castle. It gets even better. He's picked up by the local farmers. He's twisted an ankle. The police come and pick up the prisoner, Lieutenant Horn, as he identifies himself, take him to a police station. In the police station, he suddenly asks to speak to the Duke of Hamilton. He says he's come on a special mission and he wants to see the Duke of Hamilton. A phone call goes through to the Duke of Hamilton's fighter squadron. Within 1 hour, Hess and the Duke of Hamilton are speaking to each other in a cell in the police station. It's quite extraordinary. It's as though God wanted the peace mission to succeed. Duke of Hamilton wrote quite a lengthy account of their conversation, typed it in Rudolf Hess's papers, which I've just been reading in Boston in this museum. There's Rudolf Hess's 3-page account of his conversation with the Duke of Hamilton that night. More interesting for me is that the police in that police station took an inventory of everything that Rudolf Hess was carrying. He's carrying a certain limited amount of English currency on his pockets. He's carrying some letters. Carrying a little snapshot of his son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, 4 years old, a little boy that he won't see for the next 30 years, because things don't go right. He's not returned to Germany as he should have been. When you're an emissary, coming in under a white flag, so to speak, you are entitled to be listened to and to be released then to your own country unharmed once the decision has been taken on whether your offer is accepted or not. But no, he's now going to be held, says Churchill, as Churchill's personal private prisoner. That's what Churchill writes in one of his memoranda, that this man is my private prisoner. That's not all that's in the inventory taken by the police. They also list a letter that Rudolf Hess is carrying addressed to King George VI, King of England. He's carrying the letter with him. What's interesting is that after their conversation in the police cell, and there are 2 or 3 more conversations that take place subsequently, Rudolf Hess is then taken down to London a couple of days later, and he's put in the Tower of London, a typical romantic touch by that alcoholic Prime Minister of ours, Winston Churchill. He's led in through Traitor's Gate, put in a cell in the Tower of London to be held there until a special house is ready for him in Surrey, in southern England. And another inventory has taken his possessions in the Tower of London. The letter to the King of England is no longer there. I think he gave it to the Duke of Hamilton. And 2 days later, we know this from the diary of Sir Alexander Cadogan, the Duke of Hamilton is having lunch with His Majesty the King, King of England. And I think that the letter was then handed over to the King, because that's who it was addressed to. Rudolf Hess subsequently wrote 2 or 3 letters to the King of England, which I've been reading in this museum in Scotland, in Boston again, the actual letters, the handwritten copy that he made. He thanks the King of England for his chivalry and courtesy and for the special orders he'd given for his protection. But the letter reached the royal family. I think, again, it's one of those tragedies that the Germans didn't realize that the King of England has no power at all, really. In a democracy, the King of England has less power than the voters. And his first minister, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, had all the power. And the most that the King of England could do was take note of what Winston Churchill had to say. It's rather the same in your country, of course. Your president, when he came to power, he clearly thought that he was going to have the power and he was going to call the shots. I remember him, like as you all do, seeing on television that first night when he signed the order for the immediate closure of Guantanamo Bay within the next 12 months, and for the ending of military tribunals and a number of other things that he signed into office, into effect that same night. That's when he realized, of course, that when you're president of the United States, you don't really have all that much power. The real power is held by other people behind you, of whom the public never hears. And that's what happened in England with the King of England. And so I wrote to Buckingham Palace, I wrote to the Windsor Royal Archives. I said, can I see the letter, please? Can I see all your files on Rudolf Hess? Back in the 1980s, this was. And the Royal Archives wrote me a very polite letter saying, dear Mr. Irving, we're going to have to inform you that all these papers are held at the exclusive disposition of Mr. Martin Gilbert, the official historian, the Churchill official biographer, who has made no use of that file whatsoever, because, of course, it doesn't reflect very well on Rudolf Hess, on Winston Churchill at all. One day when I have time, I may go back and ask the Royal Archives again whether I can now see that file. But some of the papers I have seen, by chance, sitting working in the American Archives, and the American Archives not in College Park or Pennsylvania Avenue as they used to be, but out in Suitland, Maryland. There's an offshoot of the National Archives called the Federal Record Center. Federal Record Center. that's where the kind of historian goes who work like me. You see, the college historians, the conformist historians, they know what file they're looking for because they've got it from the index of some other book. And so they'll go to the archives of some place and they'll say, I want to see file number 1, /3, /2, /A, and this kind of thing. And they will drill straight down to that file and read it and say, oh, good, and aren't I a clever historian for reading what I've already been given by somebody else to look at? I don't do that. I bulldoze from left to right through an entire collection with a fine net looking for whatever may turn up. You never know what you're going to find. It takes longer, but you find all the stuff that other people have missed. And here in Suitland, I was going through the entire records of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. And I came across all the papers about Rudolf Hess. I was sad. And suddenly I found myself looking at 26 exercise books, handwritten, printed on the outside with the printed G, British Crown R, which is the British War Department logo, George Rex, King of England. So these were War Department files in the American archives that we had somehow lost control of. And I read them. This starts in May 1941. It goes through to October 1945. They're handwritten accounts by people who were keeping under observation a certain man referred to in these diaries as Prisoner X, who's being held at a location called Camp Z, Mitchett Place, outside Aldershot, as it turns out. And it, obviously, I realized straight away Prisoner X is Rudolf Hess. Every movement, every statement, every utterance, everything he says is recorded by these doctors and consultants and scientists who are watching him, listening in with hidden microphones in every room in this unfortunate imprisonment in Mitchett Place. In England, if they were in British archives, I would never have seen them, because the British government has a rule that medical files are held secret for eternity, in perpetuity, never released. But the Americans had got these files. They had been shipped back to Nuremberg with Rudolf Hess in October 1945, so they ended up in Nuremberg. And from Nuremberg they went to Washington, which is where they are now. And I've sat there for weeks just copying down these 26 exercise books and using them in my book on Rudolf Hess. That's why it's called The Missing Years. This is what happened after he arrived in England. Rudolf Hess very rapidly realized that his mission was going nowhere. Peace was not going to break out thanks to Winston Churchill. In fact, we tricked him. We sent 2 or 3 cabinet ministers to have talks with him in that Camp Z at Mitchett Place. The first one we sent was Sir John Simon. Sir John Simon was the Lord Chancellor, the head of the British legal profession, a liberal, and as a trial counsel he knew how to question people and get facts. What his mission from the British government was, find out whatever secrets you can from Rudolf Hess. He's the deputy of Adolf Hitler, so he knows a lot. Use your tricks as a lawyer to get the truth out of him. And Rudolf Hess realizes that it's not going, but it's an interesting conversation anyway, because the whole conversation is recorded by the hidden microphones, and there's a copy of it in Sir John Simon's papers. I read the whole transcript. Sir John Simon says to him, will you explain why you made this harebrained flight? And Rudolf Hess answers, I've got the answer on the fly leaf of this book. Rudolf Hess says, why did I make the flight? He says he made the flight because of nightmares he was having in Germany. He says, in my mind's eye I kept seeing in Germany and Britain alike an endless line of children's coffins with weeping mothers standing behind them. And then again, the coffins of mothers with their children standing, weeping behind them. Saturation bombing. There's a photograph there which I put with that quotation from his book of just such a nightmare picture. In Cologne, after one British air raid, and there's all the bodies laid out in a hangar, rows upon people, bodies of people that were killed, waiting to be put in their coffins. He was having these nightmares of open coffins with mothers standing behind them, and open coffins of mothers with their children standing behind them. And I think that says more than enough about the kind of man that Rudolf Hess was. He was a man of great principle. He's now trapped in that house in Mitchett Place. After a week or two, he realizes that the peace mission is not going to succeed and that he's failed. And that's when his schizophrenia really begins. The doctors begin observing him standing with all the typical traits of a schizophrenia victim. He's standing in the corner of the darkened cell talking to somebody for hours on end. But if he's the only person in the cell, there's nobody else there that he's talking to, but the doctors record everything that he does in these diaries. It's very sad. As June 1941 wears on, he realizes that not only has he damaged himself and put himself at risk by his harebrained flight, The German government is now announcing that unfortunately Rudolf Hess has turned mad and that in a lunatic stroke he flew to Britain. There's no mention of the peace mission. Hitler may very well have warned him. I've heard people say, isn't it likely that Hitler said to him, Mr. Hess, if you succeed, you will be the hero of the day. If you fail, we'll have to disown you and say you are a lunatic. Bad luck. That's quite possibly what happened. But he realizes he's also risking his fatherland now because he is a bearer of secrets. And the British, being how they are in wartime, no doubt they will stop short of nothing in order to find out what those secrets are, where the U-boats are being built, where they're being prefabricated, where the oil refineries are being turned underground, all these kind of secrets, which he knows the answers to. And he's frightened now that in his sleep or the British will try truth drugs on him, or by brutality, by torture or whatever. They will force these secrets out of him and he will damage his own country. Quite the opposite of what he had intended. So he kills himself, or he tries to kill himself. And mark my words now, he puts on the uniform again, the German Air Force uniform, the one that he always puts on for special occasions. He puts on the uniform, the flying boots, the helmet and everything else, and hurls himself off the third floor balcony of the house in which he plans to kill himself. He breaks a lot of bones, breaks his rib cage, damages his head, damages his arms. He's bedridden for the next 2 or 3 months in that prison. He fails to kill himself. It's significant that he put the uniform on for it. That's what matters more to me than anything else. And we do actually try to use truth drugs on him in May 1944. The Secret Service sends one of their doctors, Dr. Dix, born in Latvia, to try with truth drugs to find out if they can soften up Rudolf Hess and get secrets from him. You would have thought by May 1944 it hardly mattered. His secrets would have been very obsolete by then, but they tried. And there's the transcript in Dr. Dix's papers, I found it, of the conversation that ensued with Rudolf Hess, desperately aware that he's been injected now with some kind of noxious substance, and he's gradually succumbing to the narcotic influences of this drug, and he's fighting not to give any secrets away, and he's trying to stay awake, but only just, and the doctor's getting more and more impatient with him that the truth drug is still failing to work, and you'll find the doctor snarls at him and says, well, okay, tell us what your name is and what your rank, at least. Rudolf Hess straightens up in his chair and he says, well, my name and rank. My name is Rudolf Hess, and I'm the Deputy Führer of the Greater German Reich. So he's won that particular round. He tries one more gambit. A month or two later, he decides that he's going to start feigning total amnesia, total loss of memory, which can be brought on by schizophrenia. So the doctors were kind of semi-convinced that his amnesia was genuine, that he wasn't just putting it on. And the amnesia got worse and worse as the months progressed. His total loss of memory. He couldn't remember how to tie his shoes, couldn't remember how to do simple household tasks. And he's in that state when the war ends, and he's put aboard an American Air Force Dakota and flown from Wales, where he's now being held. He's being flown from Wales with Colonel Larcombe and British Army officers and American Army officers. He's flown to Nuremberg to be put on trial as a war criminal. His name's on the list of the top. Well, it's obvious, really, because he's deputy of Adolf Hitler. So Hitler's no longer available, so take him. He calls himself Deputy Führer, so we'll put him on trial and hang him instead. So he's sent back to Nuremberg. And that's when his ordeal really begins. In Nuremberg, Nuremberg, of course, is an American-run prison. The International Military Tribunal, the Palace of Justice, run by the Americans at American taxpayer expense. You don't realize that, but you pay for the whole of Nuremberg. The whole of that charade was paid for by you taxpayers. The chief interrogator there was a very fine American trial lawyer called Colonel John Armin. John Armin thinks that he can break this guy. Every other consultant, all four powers have had him examined now by doctors and consultants and psychiatrists. They've all concluded that he is quite genuine, that there's a genuine case of amnesia, a total loss of memory. Colonel Armin thinks he can break it. Colonel John Armin sends for Rudolf Hess, prisoner number Hess, to be brought up from the cells, brought up to Armin's office. And there's a photograph in the book showing Rudolf Hess being interrogated by Colonel John Armin of the US Army. All the other top American officers standing on either side for this big day, for this spectacle. Rudolf Hess is aware that this is another big day, so he's put on his Air Force uniform again. There he is. It's quite funny, but very significant. He's lolling back in his chair while the angry American officers are interrogating him. And he's lolling back in his chair with the fur-lined flying boots and the fur-lined and the American the Luftwaffe uniform and the lieutenant's tunic. And he's lolling back and answering questions. And we got the transcript. I think that the whole conversation was, interrogation was tape recorded because it's as detailed as that. And Colonel Armin losing his temper in a way that a trial lawyer never should. bringing in person after person from Rudolf Hess's past that he springs on him, his private secretaries. Rudolf Hess says, "No, do I know you, madam? I'm sorry." Later he writes a letter to the secretary apologizing for having pretended not to recognize her. But it's all in the greater cause. He brings in ministers and generals and people that Rudolf Hess definitely knew, but pretends he doesn't. And finally, when John Armin is really at the end of his tether, he snaps his fingers and had the biggest one of all brought in, Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering, stripped of his medals, of course, but with the famous pearl grey uniform and all the rest of it intact. He's lost some weight as well, but he's brought in, and he confronts Rudolf Hess. And Rudolf Hess looks at him with a kind of interested gaze. And Hermann Goering, very angry, says, "But snap out of it, you idiot. You know bloody well who I am." And Rudolf Hess says, "No, tell me your name. That may ring a bell." And Goering says, "I'm Hermann Goering, Reichsmarshal of the Greater German Reich, chief of the four-year plan, chief Reich Huntsman, chief of the Forschungsamt, chief of everything else. Now do you remember?" And Rudolf Hess says, "Well, you certainly seem to have held a lot of offices in the past. You seem to have been very important at one time. But you're not very important now, are you?" And Colonel John Armin knows that, I mean, it's a beautiful, balanced answer. Rudolf Hess has won the round again, and he's sent back to his cell. The trial begins in October 1945. The British judge presiding over the court, Lord Justice Lawrence, asks each prisoner how he pleads. They're brought in separately, and Rudolf Hess begins a lengthy rigmarole about this and that and not recognizing the following and his memory being totally gone, and the judge tells him to snap out of it, and he says, "Well, anyway, that will be taken as a plea of not guilty." Before Hess is led back to his cell, he makes a statement, however, with the permission of the court. And now Rudolf Hess, in front of his lawyers, who've been intending all along to plead insanity and amnesia and total loss of memory as the reasons why I couldn't be put on trial, Rudolf Hess suddenly says, "Well, I fooled the lot of you, haven't I? The Russians, the French, the Germans, the British, the Americans, all your experts, all your quacks, all your so-called doctors and psychiatrists, all of you certified that I'm completely gone and my memory is absolutely a shambles and I've total amnesia. I fooled a lot of you. My memory is better than any of you. I know more than you think." And his lawyer sinks his head in his hands. That's the end of the defense as far as he was planning it. And he's sentenced to life imprisonment. Rudolf Hess is sentenced to life imprisonment at the end of the trial in 1946. A lot of horse dealing, horse trading between the judges. If you've got time, go to Syracuse and ask to see the papers of Mr. Justice Biddle, who is the American judge there, and in his papers there you'll find a whole file of the deliberations on the day when the judges then decide between them in secret who's going to get what kind of sentence. Prize day. Who's going to be acquitted and who's going to be hanged. And we find that the Russians said that they would reluctantly agree to Rudolf Hess being spared the noose if the Allies agreed to hang General Jodl, the chief of the German Armed Forces Operations Staff, and so that little bit of horse trading was very rapidly dealt with. Rudolf Hess was then sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace. And if that one sentence doesn't expose the hypocrisy of the Nuremberg war crimes trials, nothing does. I've always said that he deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for his dramatic flight. He stayed in Nuremberg prison until April 1947, in fact, for the next many months while they were readying a special prison in Spandau. Spandau was in the British sector of Berlin. You see, Berlin at that time was like a big round cake planted in the middle of the communist zone, the Soviet zone of Germany. Hundreds of miles from the frontier, hundreds of miles from the Iron Curtain. There was this kind of four-power capital, former capital of Berlin, partly run by the Russians, partly by the British, partly by the Americans, and as a sop to General de Gaulle's vanity, partly being run by the French. Spandau prison, this ancient red brick pile, was built in the middle of the British sector of Berlin, which complicated things when the final day came. Rudolf Hess would stay there until 1987. He flew to Britain in 1941, so it's 46 years in captivity, of which the last half were in solitary confinement because his final fellow prisoners, Albert Speer, who I knew very well, Baldo von Schirach, were released in 1966, 20 years after having been sentenced. You see, they were not allowed time served. It was tacked on to the sentence that was passed down on them in 1966. They were released, leaving Rudolf Hess alone in Spandau prison. Very expensive kind of habitation by then. A prison built for 600 prisoners, with 600 cells being occupied by one prisoner and 100 guards. It was costing $100 million a year to run at the end of his stay there. 3 or 4 years before the end, he contacted the prison government and said that he needed special medical assistance now because he was now so crippled by arthritis he could no longer raise his hands above his shoulders. He could no longer tie his shoelaces. He couldn't get out of a chair unaided. He couldn't get dressed in the morning. He couldn't bath or shower except with assistance. And they gave him a male nurse to look after him, a very highly qualified male nurse, a Tunisian actually, called Abdullah Malawi. He's written a book. You won't find it on the New York Times bestseller list for obvious reasons. He's not on the right side of the fence at all. He also wrote an affidavit and sworn affidavit on what happened on the last day of Rudolf Hess's life, which was August the 17th, 1987. Rudolf Hess, by this time totally decrepit and crippled. The nurse helped him to get up that morning, the male nurse, Abdullah. He writes in his affidavit, I helped him to bath and shower that morning. I helped him to get dressed. And he said to me, when I went out at midday to have lunch, could I possibly get a new flower pot for his cell because the flower pot was cracked? And he said it wasn't just an excuse to get me out of the building because Hess knew very well that I always went out for lunch anyway. And when I was out having lunch, he said, I got an urgent call. I had to come back to the prison in a hurry. When I got back to the prison, I went to the hut in the grounds of the prison, which is where he spent all his afternoons, a regular garden shed. With one side of the shed was just wire mesh, wire netting. He said, and that's where Rudolf Hess used to like sitting in the afternoons contemplating the garden which he and his fellow prisoners had helped to create in the 47 years since the war ended. They built this garden in the grounds of the prison with the trees they planted there. Only the hut this time was in complete shambles, says to Abdullah. He said, when I came into the hut, there were lots of high-ranking American officers standing around because it was the American month for providing guard duty. The guard duty rotated month by month between the four powers. There were a lot of unfamiliar faces standing around, and everything had been kicked over in the room. The table had been kicked over, the chairs had been kicked over, the rug had been scrambled up, and I'd spent the previous evening straightening up this straw tile rug, but now it was in a mess. There'd obviously been a big fight in that hut, and Rudolf Hess was lying on the floor dead. I knew him so well, but he was lying on the floor dead. He wasn't wearing the flying uniform. He was wearing his regular clothes. He was lying on the floor dead, he said, and I spent half an hour trying to resuscitate him, giving him artificial respiration until it was obvious he was hopeless. He was dead. And he was loaded aboard a British military ambulance and taken to the British hospital in the British sector of Berlin. Because the prison statute stated that the moment the last prisoner had died, it would immediately come under British control, because it was in the British sector of Berlin. In other words, American control lapsed the moment that Rudolf Hess died. He was pronounced dead at 4:15 that afternoon. A day or two later, Britain announced the death of Rudolf Hess. A couple of days after that, they announced that he had hanged himself. He had made a noose out of a cable attaching a lamp, made a noose out of the cable and made a little loop around the other end of the cable and put it over a hook above the window, apparently. He'd hanged himself. And a couple of days after that, the British announced they'd found a suicide note in his pocket, which they've never released. They've never released the facsimile of that suicide note, only a transcript of what it contains. And Abdullah Malawi immediately began to suspect things, because he said in his affidavit, he said, one thing I noticed when I came into the hut, apart from the complete shambles it was in, was that the lamp was still plugged into the socket in the wall. So there's no question that cable hadn't been used. But it's difficult to tell now, because the British had also instructed that everything should be destroyed. The hut was immediately burnt. The cable was destroyed. The lamp was destroyed. Everything in that hut was destroyed. They would have destroyed the uniform too if they got their hands on it for some reason, but it wasn't. British military police carried out an investigation. The text of that had just been released 3 or 4 weeks ago in Britain, with many, many redacted passages cut out. For example, a prison guard, an American guard, a GI who Rudolf Hess personally couldn't abide, a black guy called Tony Jordan, had yet another argument with him that afternoon. They were constantly arguing. Rudolf Hess couldn't stand him and had asked the governor to have him replaced by somebody more agreeable. But no, the governor quite rightly said the prisoners weren't going to decide which guards they got. So Tony Jordan was kept on. Tony Jordan is still alive in Berlin today. He won't talk about the case. But the military intelligence report quotes the prison diary, the prison log that afternoon, as saying that at 2:15 that afternoon there was a violent episode involving Tony Jordan and Rudolf Hess. The name Tony Jordan's blanked out, but we know who it is. And at 2:17 p.m. there was an episode. And the rest of the paragraph has been blanked out, so you can't tell what the episode was. I'm sure that had it been connected with Rudolf Hess's death, Actually, it wouldn't have been blanked out. I don't think the British are as conniving as that. Rudolf Hess died. The son had not seen his father for the first 30 years after his flight to Scotland. He was allowed to see his father when he was in his 30s. The father, until then, had refused to see his son. He said, "I'm not going to see my son, Wolf, until I'm back in freedom and my mission has finally ended." A man of principle. Eventually he relented, and Wolf Rudiger came to see the son, and he told me that he embraced his father, and that the British who were that month in charge, the British had immediately punished the father with bread and water for a month for having violated the prison regulations and embracing his own son. It's a strange kind of thing which we can't really be very proud of in Britain. A lot of things about the case have disturbed me. The British government moved to stop any kind of investigation of the death. The Berlin public prosecutor, a man called Detlev Melis, who later on became the United Nations investigator of the assassination of Hariri, the Lebanese president. Detlev Melis told me when he came to London a couple of years later in connection with documents stolen from the Goering files in Berlin. I led the police in the right direction to who was responsible there. He said that he had started an investigation of the background of the death of Rudolf Hess in Berlin as public prosecutor, and the investigation had continued briefly until the British Foreign Office sent him an order to stop the investigation, which again seems odd. Rudolf Hess was autopsied by the British. They published no autopsy report. They then placed the remains of Rudolf Hess in a steel casket, which they welded shut, and turned the casket over to Wolf Rudiger Hess, the son, and said, "Now you can have your father back. We recommend that you take him straight to the place of burial, the family plot in Wunsiedel, and that he should be buried discreetly with no kind of public ceremony." Wolf Rudiger Hess tells me that he took the opposite decision. He took possession of the father's casket and took it to Munich, and took it to the University of Munich Forensic Pathology Department, and he invited the senior pathologist to open the casket and carry out a second autopsy. Professor Ottmar Spann. I've got the autopsy report. He says, quite definitely in the report, he says that this man was the victim of a homicide. You can tell quite simply from the positions of the ligature scars on the neck. If somebody hangs themselves, the noose slides up the back of the neck, and you get a diagonal scar on the neck. If they are strangled, then it's a horizontal scar made by the man behind, twisting the noose until it's tight. And the scars on the victims, I've seen the photographs. The scars are quite definitely horizontal. Also, of course, quite simply, Rudolf Hess would have been incapable, given his arthritis, of making the noose and of hanging it over a hook and doing everything else involved with hanging himself. The British government have behaved shamefully in the whole Rudolf Hess case. The body was subsequently buried in the family cemetery at Wunsiedel, and years later an epitaph was erected on the grave in which was inscribed a line from a letter that Rudolf Hess had written to his wife Ilse from England, from captivity. The line said quite simply, "Ich habe es wenigstens gewagt," in German. At least I did my best. At least I took the risk. And that is a fine epitaph on the man Rudolf Hess. One day perhaps I might have a similar line inscribed as my epitaph, because I take risks in writing the books that I do. You find years too late that you've taken a wrong turning on the interstate, but it's the right turning. You're on the interstate, you've got your head down, you write just what you find in the archives, and years later you find that way back there was the exit you could have taken. The exit says big money this way. But like when you're on the interstate, you can't go back. You're on the road you're on, and you're going that way. And you find out years later still that those two roads never meet. They never converge again. So you just keep, people say, "Why'd you do it?" And I keep my head down like a blind elephant charging through a forest, that's all. And eventually I hope to charge out to the daylight at the other end. And the case of Rudolf Hess is one. I've told this story many times over the last 20 years, since that day in Munich, 1991. Nothing changes. Gradually we're getting more documents with no assistance from the British government, which we know are sitting on many more transcripts and many more files. It's a shameful episode. He came to Britain in 1941 to try to stop what he deemed was otherwise inevitably going to happen. It would have saved millions of lives if we had listened. But for the vanity and prestige and historic reputation of one man, Winston Churchill, we took the other route. And millions died, and we lost in Britain everything we had. When I was born, Britain had a great empire, which was a great force for world civilization and good, I think. And we lost it all for this mad, drunken prime minister's vanity. Drunk in charge of an empire. That should be on his epitaph, I think. Thank you very much.